November 3rd, 1944, 11:47 p.m., somewhere in the Hürtgen Forest, Western Germany. The trees don't move here. That's the first thing that strikes you, the absolute suffocating stillness of the Hürtgen. No wind reaches the forest floor. The canopy above is too dense, too old, too indifferent to the war bleeding through its roots. Somewhere to the east, artillery has been firing for 6 straight hours. But in this particular clearing, in this particular moment, the only sound is the creak of frozen mud beneath a German infantryman's boots. Obergefreiter Klaus Mertens is 22 years old. He doesn't look it. His face carries the particular gauntness of a man who has been cold for so long that warmth has become a theoretical concept. Something he remembers the way you remember a childhood smell, faintly, with suspicion. His uniform, once a proud field grey, is now the colour of the forest itself. Brown, black, the grey-green of decay. His unit, a battered rifle company from the 275th Infantry Division, has been holding a stretch of frozen forest line for 11 days. 11 days of American artillery, 11 days of K-Rations they don't have, 11 days of waiting. He is not supposed to be this far forward, but the patrol had pushed deeper than ordered, drawn by the sound of something, a distant crack of timber, the faint mechanical groan of a vehicle in distress. And now Mertens stands at the edge of a shallow ravine, looking down at something that does not belong in the Hürtgen Forest, an American supply truck, tipped sideways, one wheel still spinning with the slow, lazy indifference of a thing that doesn't know it's wrecked. The driver is gone. Fled or dead, it doesn't matter which right now. What matters is the cargo. The wooden crates stenciled in black English letters that Mertens cannot fully read. What matters is the smell. Because even here, even in this frozen cathedral of mud and pine resin and death, there is a smell drifting up from those crates that stops him completely. Chocolate. He hasn't smelled chocolate in, he tries to remember. He cannot. Within 20 minutes, 4 German soldiers are crouched in the ravine, working at the crates with bayonets and bare, cracked hands. They work in the particular silence of men who are afraid of what they want, afraid of needing it, afraid of what it means that they need it this much. The first crate opens with a sound like a small exhalation, like the box itself had been holding its breath. Inside, rows of olive-drab tins, waxed cardboard boxes, small brown packages wrapped tight and dense. American K-Rations. Each one a self-contained universe of food. Canned meat, crackers, powdered coffee, a small block of compressed chocolate, 4 cigarettes wrapped in cellophane, a tiny can opener, water purification tablets, and a book of matches with the striking surface protected by a sleeve of moisture-proof paper. Mertens picks one up, turns it in his hands. It is heavier than he expects. Compact, deliberate. Every component fits against every other component with a precision that feels almost architectural. This is not food cobbled together under shortage. This is food designed, engineered for a soldier in the field, assembled with the casual confidence of a nation that has not once worried about running out of the materials to make it. He opens the chocolate first, because he is 22 years old, and it's chocolate, and the world is on fire. The taste hits him like a physical blow, rich, dense, sweet in a way that makes his eyes water. Or maybe his eyes are already watering. It's hard to tell anymore in the Hürtgen. He doesn't speak. None of them speak. They just eat, quickly, with the focused desperation of men who have learned not to trust good things to last. But Gefreiter Anton Schwarz, older, 31, a former factory worker from Dortmund who understands production lines the way other men understand weather, Schwarz is not eating yet. He is reading the label, or trying to. His English is limited, but he doesn't need English to understand what he's looking at. He understands numbers, he understands dates, he understands the small printed codes on the side of each tin that indicate batch, plant, and quantity produced. He has worked in manufacturing. He knows what production codes mean. He picks up a second tin, then a third, cross-references the codes, different plants, different states. He recognizes Chicago from somewhere, Baltimore, a third he can't place, all within the same month, October 1944. These weren't made in one factory. They were made in dozens of factories, across thousands of miles, and somehow they ended up in the same crate, in the same truck, in a ravine in the Hürtgen Forest, within weeks of production. Schwarz sits back on his heels in the mud. Wie viele? Mertens asks between bites. How many? Schwarz doesn't answer immediately. He's still looking at the tin in his hand. The weight of it, the perfect, unremarkable, mass-produced weight of it. Genug, he finally says. Enough. But his voice carries something underneath the word that Mertens doesn't want to examine too closely. Because it isn't awe exactly. It isn't even fear. It's the particular quiet of a man who has just done a calculation in his head and arrived at an answer he wishes he hadn't. In the second crate, cigarettes. Dozens of packs, Lucky Strikes Chesterfields, wrapped in cellophane so clean and tight that Schwarz actually laughs, a short, hollow sound. He's holding a pack of cigarettes that crossed the Atlantic Ocean, survived the journey from some American warehouse to the French coast to the front lines of the Hürtgen Forest, and the cellophane isn't even creased. The third crate contains equipment, wool socks, dry. Mertens stares at them for a long moment. His own socks have been wet for 9 days. He has been rotating them against his skin, sleeping with them pressed to his chest, trying to dry them with body heat. He has on 2 separate occasions cried about his socks, not loudly, not where anyone could hear, but in the specific private misery of a soldier who has been reduced to caring desperately about socks. He takes a pair, pulls off his boots right there in the ravine, in the mud, in the dark, and puts on dry American socks. And for a moment, just a moment, the war is very far away, but Schwarz is still reading labels. Later, back in the German line, the contents of the crates are distributed quietly among the company. The food disappears quickly. Men eat with their backs turned, protective, the way you eat when you haven't eaten in a while. The cigarettes last a little longer. The socks cause brief, almost absurd arguments over sizes. But word of what Schwarz found, what he figured out, moves through the company differently, not as a story, more like a virus. The kind of information that once it enters a system cannot be removed. An American K-Ration costs approximately $1.37 to produce. In 1944, the United States is producing over 100 million of them per month. Hauptmann Werner Baumann, commanding what remains of the company, 112 men where there should be 200, sits in his command post, which is a hole in the ground covered with pine boughs, and looks at the tin that Schwarz has placed in front of him without comment. Baumann is a professional soldier. He fought in Poland, he fought in France in 1940, when winning still felt possible. He has opinions about tactics and terrain and ammunition discipline that are generally sound. He does not have an opinion about this tin, because this tin is not a tactical problem. This tin is a different kind of problem entirely. He picks it up, reads the label, sets it down. Outside, the American artillery starts again, rolling thunder from the west, rhythmic and patient and completely, utterly relentless. It has been that way for weeks. Every time the Germans count shells and think they must be running low, more shells come. Every time a resupply road gets cut, a new one opens. Every time a position seems untenable, the weight of American material simply increases. Baumann looks at the tin. The tin looks back. It is, he realizes, the most honest briefing he has received in 2 years of war. No propaganda, no revised maps, no optimistic assessments from officers who haven't seen the front. Just a small, olive-drab container that crossed an ocean to tell him, in the plainest possible terms, exactly what he is fighting. Not an army, an economy, An economy that is producing all of this, while simultaneously building tanks, ships, aircraft, artillery shells, jeeps, and everything else required to run a war across two oceans simultaneously. An economy that has not been bombed, an economy whose factories have not been touched. An economy that, unlike Germany's, is not rationing rubber or steel or aluminum or copper in ways that shorten the life of every shell, every vehicle, every boot. An economy that is, by every measurable standard, not even particularly strained yet. He picks up the tin again, turns it over, sets it back down. Somewhere outside, a young soldier from Bavaria is eating American chocolate for the first time in his life and trying to remember what it felt like to believe the war was going well. Baumann reaches for his pen. He has a report to write. The report will be accurate. The report will go up the chain of command. The report will, in all likelihood, be softened by the time it reaches anyone who could act on it. Filed under some euphemism for the situation is more difficult than previously assessed. But right now, in this hole in the ground in the Hürtgen Forest, Werner Baumann writes the truth. He writes it quickly, before the instinct for self-preservation rewrites it into something more comfortable. The material disparity, he writes, is no longer a gap. It is a gulf, and it is widening. He pauses, listens to the artillery, counts the seconds between impacts. They are getting shorter. He underlines the last sentence. Then he puts the American tin in his coat pocket. He'll eat it later, he tells himself, when he's hungry, which he always is, and goes back to commanding men in a forest that is eating them alive, on behalf of a war machine that has just been described with complete and devastating accuracy by a small cardboard box. The Hürtgen doesn't care. The trees still don't move. The chocolate was gone by morning. But the knowledge, the specific corrosive knowledge that Schwarz had pulled out of those production codes like a splinter from infected skin, that stayed, that metastasized, that moved through the 275th Infantry Division, the way truth moves through men who have been fed lies long enough to recognize the difference by texture alone. It didn't announce itself. It didn't arrive with drama or revelation. It came quietly, the way cold comes, not all at once, but in degrees, until you look up one morning and realize you stopped feeling your hands sometime in the last hour, and you're not sure exactly when. 22 kilometers south, in a reserve position that was supposed to be a rest billet and had become simply a slightly less dangerous place to be exhausted, Feldwebel Heinrich Gruber was doing what sergeants have done in every army since armies existed, keeping his men from thinking too hard. It was, by late 1944, a full-time occupation. Gruber was 34, a mason by trade from a small town outside Cologne that he had not seen in 14 months. He had 3 children, whose faces he reconstructed each night from memory, with the focused concentration of a man who understands that memory, unexercised, begins to blur at the edges. His eldest daughter was 9. He had been gone for more of her life than he had been present for, and this was a calculation he did not allow himself to complete. He was good at his job, not in the way that gets men decorated, not theatrical bravery or tactical brilliance, but in the specific, unglamorous competence of a man who keeps ammunition counted and socks dry and morale just above the threshold where soldiers stop functioning. He understood that an army moves on its stomach, yes, but it fights on something harder to quantify, something closer to faith. Not religious faith, the Hürtgen had largely burned that out, but the operational faith that effort produces results. That suffering means something, that the next push will be the one that turns it, that faith was becoming difficult to maintain in November 1944. Because the Americans kept coming. Not in waves, not in the dramatic surges of early war, but in the particular, grinding industrial patience of a force that has calculated the arithmetic of attrition and is comfortable with the answer. Every German position taken cost American lives. Nobody was pretending otherwise. But for every American that fell, the replacements arrived. Fresh, fed, equipped with weapons that hadn't been cannibalized for parts, wearing boots that fit, carrying radios that worked. Gruber had watched a captured American sergeant eat a de-rationed chocolate bar last week while waiting for processing. The man had eaten it with the casual indifference of someone consuming a thing that is simply available. Not savoring it, not rationing it, just eating it. The way you eat something when you know there will be more. That image had stayed with Gruber in a way that a dozen artillery barrages had not. The stories from the captured supply truck reached his billet through Unteroffizier Dieter Franke, a signals operator who had an extraordinary talent for information movement and a corresponding weakness for the weight of bad news. Franke delivered it the way he delivered all intelligence, seated in a low voice with the particular gravity of a man who needs someone else to share the burden of knowing. He laid it out plainly: the production codes, the multiple factories, the quantities, the dry socks, the cigarettes in their perfect cellophane. Gruber listened without interrupting. When Franke finished, the sergeant sat quietly for a moment. Outside, American P-47 Thunderbolts were working over something to the north. You could hear the distant, distinctive snarl of their engines, the rhythmic percussion of their guns. They had been doing this for days. German air cover by this point in the war was a memory and a rumor. "How many factories?" Gruber asked. "Schwartz counted codes from at least 8 separate production plants," Franke said. "In one crate." Gruber nodded slowly. He didn't say anything for a long time. Here is what Gruber knew. Because he was a mason, because he understood materials and quantities and what it takes to build something at scale, Germany's war economy in 1944 was a masterpiece of improvisation under pressure. Albert Speer had performed genuine miracles of industrial management, dispersing production, substituting materials, squeezing output from a system that was being systematically dismantled from the air. German engineers were producing weapons of extraordinary technical sophistication: the Tiger tank, the Me-262, the V-2 rocket, things that in isolation were breathtaking. But here was the problem with breathtaking things. You couldn't make enough of them. A Tiger tank required approximately 300,000 man-hours to produce. The Americans were building Sherman tanks, less sophisticated, less armored, less individually lethal, in roughly 10,000 man-hours. Germany produced about 1,350 Tigers across the entire war. The Americans produced over 49,000 Shermans. The math was not subtle. And that was just tanks. Gruber had heard, through the particular underground of frontline information that officers never fully controlled, about the American Liberty ships, cargo vessels being produced in American shipyards at a rate that had initially seemed like enemy propaganda, 14 days from keel laying to launch at peak production. One shipyard in California had launched one in 4 days, 15 hours, and 26 minutes as a demonstration. They were building ships the way a factory builds chairs. He thought about the socks. He thought about 8 production plants in one crate. He thought about his men's boots, which were held together in 3 separate cases with wire and conviction, and which would not survive another month of the Hürtgen's mud. "Don't tell the younger ones," he said finally. Franke looked at him. "They'll find out." "I know," Gruber said, "but let them find out slowly. Let them find out the way you find out water is cold, by getting into it, not by someone telling you the temperature." Franke nodded. He understood. This was the particular mercy of experienced soldiers, not protecting men from the truth, but managing the speed at which truth arrived. Because there is a version of knowledge that breaks men, and there is a version that hardens them, and the difference is almost entirely about pace and context and whether there is still something to hold on to when the knowing settles in. What the German High Command understood, and had understood, with varying degrees of honesty, since at least 1942, was that the war against American industrial capacity was not a war that could be won through production. It could only be won, if it could be won at all, through will, through politics, through making the cost of victory high enough that the Americans would negotiate rather than continue. This was, in its own way, a coherent strategy. It was also a strategy that required the American public to behave in a specific manner, to grow tired, to grow politically fractured, to elect leadership that would trade victory for an acceptable peace. It required, in other words, the Americans to be something other than what they were. The men on the ground in the Hürtgen didn't think in these geopolitical terms, but they felt the shape of it, the particular hollow feeling of fighting a battle whose outcome depends not on what you do, but on what the enemy decides. It is the most powerless position a soldier can occupy. To fight well, to hold ground, to take casualties and inflict them and hold the line, and to know that all of it, every bit of it, is contingent on a decision being made in Washington by civilians who are not cold, who are not in the Hürtgen, who are sitting in heated rooms, eating adequately and reading favorable newspapers. The American economy had not been asked to sacrifice, not truly. There were rationing programs, butter, rubber, gasoline, but they were inconveniences, not deprivations. American factory workers were not going hungry. American civilians were not being bombed. American mothers were losing sons, and that grief was real and enormous. But the infrastructure of American life, the supermarkets and the diners and the baseball games and the factories running 3 shifts, continued essentially undisrupted on the other side of an ocean that the Luftwaffe could not cross. Gruber didn't know the specific numbers, but he knew the shape of it. Every soldier on the German side knew the shape of it by late 1944, even if they couldn't have articulated it in economic terms. You could feel it in the weight of incoming fire. You could feel it in the frequency of American resupply. You could feel it in the quality of captured equipment, the redundancy of it, the standardization, the complete absence of the improvisation that marked everything German by this stage of the war. You could feel it in a pair of dry socks. 3 days after the supply truck was found, a young grenadier named Peter Haus, 18 years old, drafted 6 months ago, still technically in possession of the optimism that basic training had not fully stripped, found a partially opened crate that had been missed in the initial distribution. Inside, American field ration crackers, individually wrapped, a small tin of processed cheese spread, and at the bottom, wrapped in brown paper and slightly water-damaged, a paperback book. Hess couldn't read English. He sat with the book for a long time anyway, turning the pages with the careful reverence of someone handling an artifact from an incomprehensible civilization. He looked at the pictures. There were a few scattered through the text, ordinary American scenes, a street, a diner, a car. What struck him was not the content, it was the book itself. That someone somewhere in the American supply chain had thought to include a book, not because it was tactically necessary, not because it contributed to combat effectiveness in any measurable way, but because somewhere in the vast, churning machinery of American wartime logistics, a human being had decided that a soldier in the field might want something to read, that there was enough slack in the system, enough surplus, enough organizational bandwidth, enough simple abundance to include a paperback novel in a combat ration package. Haus set the book down very carefully. He was 18 years old, and he had been told, repeatedly and with great conviction, that Germany was winning, or would win, or was in a temporary strategic reorientation that would culminate in victory once the new weapons were deployed, once the winter worked in their favor, once the enemy's will collapsed under the weight of German resistance. He picked up the book again, looked at the cover, looked at the diner in the photograph inside. He thought about the American soldier who had carried this book and lost it or abandoned it or simply left it in a crate because there would always be another one, who had eaten the crackers without savoring them because there would always be more crackers, who had smoked the cigarettes from the perfectly wrapped cellophane pack without thinking about the cellophane because the cellophane was just how things came. He thought about his own ration that morning. Black bread, hard enough to require deliberate effort, a scraping of margarine, ersatz coffee that tasted of chicory and disappointment. He put the book in his coat, not to read, he couldn't read it, just to have. The way you keep something that came from a world you're only beginning to understand, you're losing to. Outside, the artillery started again. It always started again. The Hürtgen Forest would consume approximately 33,000 American casualties before it was finished. It would consume the 275th Infantry Division almost entirely. Mertens would survive it, barely, and with a wound to his left hand that would end his war in February. Schwarz would not. Baumann would be transferred east in December, which was either a punishment or a mercy depending on your perspective, and would spend the last months of the war doing the same calculation with the same answer, with Russian equipment instead of American. Gruber would make it to April 1945. He would see Cologne, what remained of it. He would find his house standing improbably in a neighborhood that was otherwise rubble. He would sit on the front step and eat a cigarette from a pack given to him by an American soldier who had more cigarettes than he knew what to do with. And he would think about the supply truck, about the production codes, about Franke's voice in the dark saying at least 8 separate production plants. He had known since November. He had known, and he had kept fighting, because that is what soldiers do. Not because they believe in the outcome, but because the men beside them are real, and the cold is real, and the next hour is the only thing that can be addressed right now. But he had known. They had all known. The chocolate had told them.